It's been a rocky week for investors in US shares as markets react to ongoing tariff uncertainty. Recent tariff changes announced by President Trump set to increase the import duties significantly, raising concerns about the impact on the US economy and also global growth. Economists warn the disruptions could lead to higher inflation and extended higher interest rates as the unpredictability of US trade policies continue to unsettle businesses and consumers alike. For more, we're joined by Shane Oliver, Chief Economist at AMP. Great to see you on Ticker, Shane.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right, we've been watching very closely what's been happening on the markets. I'm sure you have been too. What do you believe the causes are? Is it all tariffs?
I think it's mostly the tariffs, but also the wider uncertainty coming out of the US. So we know the tariffs are on the way. Some have already started. But of course, the news around them is very volatile. You know, tariffs can be put on one day and then wound back the next, particularly on Canada and Mexico. There's quite a lot of tariff news still to come. Trump has promised more tariffs on April the 2nd. Then, of course, there's uncertainty about the cutbacks in the US via Elon Musk's DOGE, or the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which is causing additional uncertainty. So all of this is feeding into the mix. Concerns about weaker growth in the US have been building for a while now. Donald Trump refused to rule out the prospect of a recession, talking about a transition in the and disruption associated with that. So that's added to the uncertainty. There's concern that the tariffs will add to inflation, keeping the Fed on hold or keeping interest rates higher for longer, and then the broader flow on globally. And of course, we know from history, our own experience over the last many years, that big moves in Wall Street do have an impact on the Australian share market. So it's basically comes back to the change in policy coming out of the US that's leading to immense uncertainty.
Some economists are saying this is starting to look like a capitulation by the market, that there's something big going on here. You mentioned the seesawing and the whiplash that investors have had about the on and off and on tariffs. Do you think that now investors are certain it's happening and they are starting to really think about the impact to the US economy?
I think that's right. Initially, there was euphoria after Donald Trump won. I think there was an expectation that the focus would be on his tax cuts and deregulation, and that would ultimately be good for shares. And so markets zoomed up in response to that, as did the US dollar. Now, of course, the reality is sinking in that it's going to be a pretty rough ride, that there's a lot of uncertainty. There seems to be inconsistencies in some of the policies that get announced. And that, of course, is seeing the focus shift from the more positive aspects of Trump's policy toolkit, tax cuts and deregulation, back to the more negative, the tariffs. And markets, therefore, are starting to factor that in, and this risk that it could trigger a recession in the short term. And of course, we have seen some weaker data coming out of the US over the last few months, which has sort of added to that concern. But it is, a bit of capitulation. Market initially optimistic about the new Trump government, now having second thoughts.
Now, talk to us about some of the data we're expecting to see out this week. You mentioned we've seen some, but we've got jobs data coming out as well. The economic data released in the week. What do you think we'll see and what impact will that have? Are there any bright spots for investors at the moment?
Well, there's a bunch of things going on this week. Locally, it's not a big one. We get some confidence data out, but I don't think that's going to move the market dramatically. Most of the focus is going to be on the tariffs. In the next 24 hours or so, we'll get news that the steel and aluminium tariffs have started up. Big question there is whether Australia gets an exemption. I kind of think that's a little bit beside the key issues. It's not the main issue regarding those tariffs. Obviously, if we're not exempted on steel and aluminium, that's bad news for our producers in those two sectors. But by the same token, that's something like 0.03% of our GDP. The broader impact will come if those tariffs are imposed on other things like Australian meat exports or pharmaceuticals. So that's a bigger risk, and we won't find that out until we get to April. So there's the tariffs. There's US inflation data to come out this week as well. That's probably going to show, I think, US inflation treading water, but it might look a little bit less scary than it has over the last few months. So that might be seen as good news in all of this. Then, of course, there's issues in Europe coming up in the week ahead. with Europe, Germany in particular, wanting to pass more stimulus through its parliament, the current parliament, before the new one takes over. And then to do that, they need to get the Greens on side. So there's a whole bunch of policy issues floating around globally, and they're probably going to be the big ones, tariffs being the main issue in the US.
Yeah, all roads lead to the White House, though, when it comes to all of those issues you just raised.